Welcome back to the Optimized Pharmacy podcast, where today we discuss strategies to grow your pharmacy, tools to accelerate that growth, and how top pharmacies are executing and winning. Now, that'll be the last time we say that opener. If you are joining us for the first time, if you're joining us for a second, a third, a seventh, I think this is episode number 8. So if you're on number 8, appreciate you. But we have decided to change the name of the podcast and pivot to kind of open the doors a little bit to some other people that we want to bring onto the podcast. And so it's still going to be pharmacy related. It's still going to be beneficial if you are a pharmacy owner, but we're going to incorporate a little bit more functional medicine providers, and just people in the health and wellness space, so that there's a little bit more cross collaboration and value that's being exchanged for pharmacy owners, for practices, and just all people in the space. And so the name of the new podcast will be the Money Medicine Podcast. We'll figure out the tagline at a later date. But again, if you're listening to the episode number 8, this will be the last time that we use that intro, and all time moving forward, we'll figure out a new tagline, and it will be the Money Medicine Podcast. So hoping that you still follow us along on that journey, because we'll, again, open the door for some amazing guests that we've been wanting to have on, and we'll be able to now because they'll have more of a reason to join us.
So kind of where did the idea to switch from kind of pharmacies to functional medicine, like where did that come from, I guess?
Yeah, I think it probably happened, a couple months ago, where I was really liking the direction of the podcast and really enjoying the podcast. So I knew that I didn't want to kill it by any means. Obviously love doing the episodes with you, but we're getting a lot of clients that are not pharmacies, but are running the same playbook. So it's like a lot of the conversations that I feel like we're having on this podcast or with pharmacy owners, we're also having with functional medicine practices,
right.
Podiatrists, or not podiatrists, sorry, I should take that back. Maybe chiropractors, et cetera. We're having these same kind of conversations. So it's, if I'm going to have this podcast that's only for pharmacy owners, then I also feel like maybe limiting or, clients, kind of other people that could learn from the podcast just naturally won't check it out because they wouldn't feel like it's for them. And so I think, one, it will maybe pull some more people in that will be able to, or be more interested to tuning into the podcast because of maybe the broadness of who it is for. But also too, I think for guests, if I was a non-pharmacy owner, but we think it'd be beneficial to a pharmacy owner to have, let's just say, a functional medicine, provider, someone come on and talk about what they're doing and maybe try to pull it into pharmacy in some way. They might just be hesitant to come on because they don't feel like there's value to them or there's their audience. And so, again, it's wider. The thought process is that it will also expand the types of guests that would be willing to come on the podcast too. If that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, especially because when we look at it, there are so many individuals. As far as functional medicine and pharmacies go, they still work a lot of times hand in hand. There's a lot of overlay. It makes more sense to broaden the scope. And I think you probably agree, but pharmacists, especially like being in one that I'm more involved with the business aspect and also in working in like larger retail chains, we seem to be tighter as far as like finances kind of go, where we see like, oh, if something costs me $100, I don't want to spend that. Whereas individuals in the functional medicine space, they're more willing to spend money to better their business. And I think that's kind of why you see a big downfall in a lot of small independent pharmacies, is because they're not willing to develop themselves. And I feel like functional medicine is a growing field that's looking to develop itself. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I definitely have noticed a trend where there's maybe a little bit more desire for personal development in that space. But I think what's interesting about it is they're a lot more similar than I think people realize, in the sense of like pharmacies, for example, if you're filling scripts, kind of just the generic thought process right now is if you're just filling retail scripts, you're not making much money. DIR fees, you're kind of getting squeezed. There's not much money in it, right?
Right.
You'll hear a lot of people in the functional medicine space also kind of say like, hey, our margins are thin, or obviously if they're accepting insurance and stuff like that, if it's cash based, it's different. But like a lot of these providers are also feeling the pinch on their side of their business as well with insurance, and they're making their money on supplements, right? That's like their healthy margin kind of revenue stream that they're all looking to grow. So it's like they're different problems, but there's plenty of pharmacies that have tight margins on their core business, but are looking to add and kind of bolt on that supplement revenue. And then there's tons of providers that also have some compression in their margins, and a lot of roll-ups happening in hospital systems trying to buy these little practices and stuff like that. And so they're also trying to kind of bolt on that supplement revenue as well. So it's like there's a lot of similarities, and there also are some differences. There's some functional medicine practices, cash-based, crushing it, that kind of thing. But I also think that there's some pharmacies that are, maybe compounding pharmacies, et cetera, that have great margins and are crushing it and doing a bunch of scripts and stuff like that as well. So I just think that they're very similar, different but similar. And so that's why we've gotten kind of a mix of clientele of both. And so it just didn't make sense to have a podcast only for one, when I think that there could be value exchanged across the board from both.
I agree. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So anyways, that's the reason for the changing of the podcast. I think it will only make things better. I think it makes sense to rebrand kind of earlier than later. And so we won't rebrand again. We're not just grass is greener. This is kind of a strategic decision that I think will open up some doors. And so it'll only lead to better episodes. So with that in mind, Logan and I were obviously talking before the podcast, as we always do, figuring out what we're going to talk about, and just kind of different today's events. And because you're doing a lot of hiring, and kind of moving around with employees, we're doing some hiring over here as well. I think a great episode for today is kind of talking about hiring, and not necessarily like do's and don'ts and make it super like binary, but more so some lessons learned along the way, and also some perspectives maybe to share on the hiring process. So I guess for you, Logan, what are things looking like at the pharmacy from a hiring perspective that you have started to implement? And then also, what have you noticed running the pharmacy, being a part of the pharmacy, in terms of how that's improved workflow, all that kind of stuff?
So a process that we started doing was really just never not hiring. So we are consistently interviewing individuals, regardless if we're full staffed or not. And it's really opened up a lot of doors as far as I can now look at my team and I can rate them on a spectrum, and I can say, this is my A player, here's my B player, he's a C player, and here's a D player, right? And now I can, as I do an interview, I can say, well, this person is going to be at least a B player. Well, now I can get rid of a C or a D who's not really kind of developing as a individual, and not helping the business out. Because at the end of the day, your business is only as good as your team. If you have somebody who consistently drops the ball, is rude with customers, or doesn't show up to work, like, why are they there? And so that's something that we've recently implemented that I really, really like. And it has helped out our team quite a bit, because we have had to separate ways with a few individuals, strictly just because they were bringing down the rest of our team. And you can't afford not to grow.
Yeah. So let me play devil's advocate here. If you're constantly hiring, or at least constantly like interviewing, how has that been internally with the team in terms of like people feeling like they don't have to walk around on like pins and needles? Like, man, if I screw up once, I'm going to lose my job, because they're always hiring, or they're always kind of interviewing and moving off of people. Like, how do you kind of balance that? Or have you gotten any feedback from employees on that?
No one's really said anything. I think the biggest piece is that we're really pushing development. And so we're trying not to have people in stagnant roles. And when I say that, what I mean is, if you were hired on as a technician, I said, you're only going to process scripts, count them, and get them down to a pharmacist. Your role is stagnant, and your pay, therefore, is stagnant, right? Because you're not, that's the job that you were hired on at that wage. Well, everyone wants to make more money, right? And so now what I need to do is I need to develop that individual and say, okay, now I need you to also do this, but I'm also willing to pay you more for it. And so these individuals aren't necessarily as nervous because my A players or B players, they want to develop. And so they're willing to take on new roles. Whereas now it's really kind of feeding out the individuals who aren't going to do that. And since they're already not going to do that, they kind of already know that they're on a chopping block as it is. There's just no one to replace them. One thing I will say, though, that it has kind of opened our eyes to is that our process of onboarding and training some individuals, we're really revamping that because we're learning that there's actually a lot of gaps in our new hire input and paperworks and how we're doing it. And so it's actually benefited us on that side because now we can really fine tune that, because when we're only hiring one person a year, two people a year, whatever it was, it didn't really matter if our onboarding process sucked because you did it once a year and it is what it is. But now it's like,
and even if it was good, you'd forget it by the time you did it that next time.
Right. So it's a blessing in disguise as far as kind of going through that process, even though it's pretty painstaking to ever bring anyone new on, because you have to you forget all the things that you know, and then to try to remember to teach somebody like, oh yeah, you can't do that. It has to be done this way. I should have taught you that. But now it's like we have all these SOPs or procedures that they have to follow through now, because we realize, when we hired on person A, oh, we forgot that. So now person B gets that. And then once again, we learn we miss on something for person B. So then we go back and we correct it. So it's been a really good process, even though it's kind of a pain.
Yeah. I think you bring up a couple interesting points, which is, I think a lot of people are scared to hire or afraid of hiring because of the work that goes into it. And obviously at first, speak to this, correct me if I'm wrong on your end, but there's a lot of work in the first interviews and the first couple of hires. But kind of like you alluded to, if you are doing it a little bit more frequently, and you're also, said another way, looking at a lot of apples from a hiring perspective, you also know what a good apple looks like. And I think there's a lot of companies that don't hire and then get stuck with people that they know aren't good, but just the work of, getting rid of that person short term, probably having a little bit of labor shortage, and then being, interviewing people, kind of exposing your business a little bit to some new people, some new eyeballs, and then potentially hiring someone who's better, potentially hiring someone who's not. Just the risk, if you will, of it scares them away from it. And that's understandable. But one thing that I'll never forget hearing, and I forget who said it, I definitely can associate it with Layla Hermosi at one point. But, what if she said something like, what if I train my employees and then they leave? What if I pour into my employees and they leave? And she posed the question, well, what if you don't pour into them and they stay? You know what I mean? And I think everyone thinks of that scarcity mindset, man, well, what if I send them to a bunch of conferences and then they open up a pharmacy across the street? There's probably some contractual stuff that you can do to prevent that. But what if you don't pour into your employees and they all stay? That's terrible. I'd rather lose good talent because I had good talent and they just saw an opportunity and they wanted to better their lives than constantly be surrounded by people that I know won't leave me because they won't be employable elsewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think not only that, but for the most part, if you're pouring in a lot to an employee and you're giving them all these things, in regardless if you have to make a contract up or not, they kind of feel indebted to you. I feel like the likelihood of them all of a sudden be like, screw you, I want to take your business down, is probably pretty low. I know I've left.
And if they left, they'd probably, hey, for whatever reason, I have to go do this for me and my family, and that's fine. But, speak highly of you on the way out. I'm going to give you the 2-week notice and work the full 2 weeks. I'm not just going to not show up anymore. And if they have good friends, and other people in the pharmacy space, they'd probably say, hey, I'm leaving a void. You should go take that job. They're great. You know what I mean? And so you might lose someone, but you'd get replaced by someone who's, maybe 80%, 90%, or even just as good, to kind of fill those footsteps.
No, I would agree. And not only that, I think sometimes you can actually broaden your scope of your business that way, because now that person who's still probably going to be friendly with you is going to learn new skills at a new job. And they may be willing, depending on what it is, they might be able to share some of that information with you. Let's say, they find out something big is going to be in the market and it could be beneficial for you. They may be able to share that information and say, hey, here's what we learned about XYZ, just thought you should know. And it could be something that, that would work out for you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. One thing with hiring that I think is probably consistent with a lot of other areas of life is I think hiring gets a bad rap, and in some ways is warranted, but I think in other ways, having a bad experience doesn't mean that the concept of it is bad in and of itself. Meaning, if the execution is poor, it's easy to just blame the thing. Right. So right. If you, for example, I'll just use simple analogies, go to the gym, you have one bad trainer and then you don't want to go back to the gym again. Right. That was one bad experience, but you were still doing the right activity. Right. Or yep. You dated someone and you had a bad breakup, you had a bad experience, so they cheated on you. It's that doesn't mean every person will be like that. It doesn't mean that you should stop dating, that love's not for you, etc. But I think a lot of people arrive at that conclusion. So hiring is one of those processes where you have a couple horror stories or even just uncomfortable situations. It's part of running a business, and you just let it sideline you for, years. And then you're in a far worse position than you could have been if you would have just taken the punch and rolled with it. You know what I mean?
Right. No, 100%, because let me share a small story. So we started this, I don't know, probably 5 months ago now, if that, and we hired on somebody. We knew that there were going to be some limitations, and after they had separated ways with us, we found out that they were actually deleting prescriptions from our system. So a new script would come in, and whether it was by accident or not, I don't know, but it would be deleted. And who knows how much damage that caused as far as patients not having scripts sent in, all this extra work. It's knowing that there were going to be limitations ahead of time versus just taking the open body. If we would have had that process in place beforehand, it could have saved us that experience. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a big piece of having those repetitions in to know that some things just aren't going to work out to begin with. We should have just said, we appreciate it, we're going to move on to another candidate, versus just taking the first willed body because we needed to fill the spot. Yeah.
Well, not to play devil's advocate again, but I'm just curious what you felt that at Keystone in particular. You see a lot of companies right now that are kind of adopting the mindset more with less. There's kind of originally there was the concept of silent, what was it called? Silent hiring, or what was it? Silent quitting. It maybe was the concept where it was people were working double jobs and no one knew, right? Is that kind of what the concept was, silent quitting? I'm probably getting the words wrong, but long story short, people were working multiple jobs and kind of keeping it hush. And then the flip side concept now is employers are firing people and then silently kind of adding responsibilities and tasks with no pay increase to those individuals, and kind of it's this, this balancing act, just with anything, a rubber band, you go too far one way, it kind of snaps back the other. But what are you guys doing as far as Keystone when it comes to hiring employees? Is it just hey, we need X amount of bodies? Is it, are you obviously taking a look at kind of payroll as a percentage of, scripts as a percentage of revenue, et cetera? How are you arriving at how many people you want to hire? If you're constantly kind of hiring, and, have there been situations where you decided to maybe hire, instead of 2 people, only hire 1, but the one was so great that you thought that they could fulfill 2 roles, and so you obviously paid them more? How are you balancing that? And that's a loaded question, but
that is quite the question. I don't know if necessarily we've had the case where we've had such a great individual. I think in the pharmacy space, it's really difficult to find like a technician who can really wow you. And I say that just because most of the time those technicians are just paid like whatever pharmacy they are at. And if, you're looking for a pharmacy that you're a fantastic technician, please reach out to me. But it's so hard.
You have a fantastic technician that's moving to Michigan.
Yes, in the Grand Rapids area.
Yeah.
They're hard to come by because no one wants to let them go. So they get paid well, even if they're in a position that they may not love. And that's kind of where step one is. Step two, we kind of hire based on what script volume's kind of doing and what we have affordable, like that makes sense. Because you never want to be in that position where you need more workers. Like I'd rather have an extra body and be able to have like excellent customer service and like always have good feedback than all of a sudden be short too many people. And then my service goes down and then people leave negative reviews. And it just kind of has that negative spiral down. And so even if it costs me a few extra dollars, I'd rather take that than have bad service.
Yeah, that makes sense. The reason I ask is obviously kind of what I alluded to, which is, and maybe it's hard to do in the pharmacy space, but I can at least speak from experience on my end. And some of this is still to be played out, but I'm firmly of the belief of like I'd rather have less bodies, less people to manage, and pay handsomely for those people if I think that they're really worth it. And a quote and a person that I listen to for a lot of business advice, but I really like particularly on this subject is Keith Cunningham when he talks about kind of employees. And what's interesting is like in his books he'll talk a lot about like being cheap and not like pimping out your ride as a business owner and not like necessarily spending money on different things. But one thing he at least practices and kind of preaches is compensating your A players so that they don't leave. And his kind of like personal rule, at least again, as he kind of expresses, is he doesn't lose A players based on compensation. If they want to, they have to move away and they're unable to keep the job that they're currently at, or they just want a change of scene. They want a change of like career. Like he can't control those different options, but if you're leaving for another job doing the exact same thing with just getting paid more, like his personal rule is like, if you're an A player, I'm not losing you to compensation. And so, at least for me, and kind of speaking from my experience, and it still has to be played out, like when I think someone's really good, like I will kind of pay to keep them on board and to keep them happy and to keep them committed, to the job, because I'd rather have less bodies. Like I don't want two people that even if the pay comes out to the same, even if they're, let's just say easy math, $10 an hour, and they match the same amount of work as someone who I could pay $20 an hour and they would accomplish the same amount. Like in some ways I could see you'd want the two bodies, because then if one person gets sick, you still have someone. But on the other hand, it's like, I'm thinking from just the management standpoint, and I'm small in a lot of cases compared to other companies, but it's like just the sheer bodies of the people to check in with and the people that you're managing and just the complexities of that. Like I'd rather just have less bodies. And I think you're seeing a lot of companies, again, much bigger companies kind of consolidate, and like how many people do we actually really need to run this company versus like, let's just hire people because it would be nice. You know what I mean?
Right. And I think it goes to that point of having skills, right? That single individual has more skills than those two individuals kind of have apart. And it kind of goes to that point to what we were talking about earlier about, in one of the gym groups I'm in, we talk about like buy once, cry once. So I buy better material. I buy better gym equipment, even though it's going to sting a whole lot more because I'm going to have to pay a much more premium price. I get all the benefits, the skills, the things that come with it. And I think that's kind of the point that you're making, is that you'd much rather have an employee who has skills, that's an A ranked employee. You'd pay them more because they're going to be able to do more for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a belief system maybe, and this will vary person to person, but like I naturally don't go to the what is the cheapest way that I can solve this problem. Because I just think there are benefits to, I think, being stingy, if you will, with how you spend. But I think the negative is, I think if you do it across the board, it can cripple you. Like a perfect example, I was talking to a guy, the other night about this, and he just said something along the lines of, when they hire people for their company, it's pick your laptop, I don't care the price. Like pick your computer, I don't care the price. Like it just better be good. We're going to spend 8 to 10 hours on this thing every single day. Like I'm not going to be cheap and get a $1,500 computer for you when I should have got you a $3,000 computer. You're going to use it 8 to 10 hours a day. You're going to use it 365 days a year, probably multiple years. Like if you really break that down into like the dollar difference per day or the pennies difference per day, like you should just bite the bullet and get the nicer thing that is more efficient, that produces better, more efficiently, all that kind of stuff. Because like, that's not the time to be cheap, right? And so I think there are plenty of people that are cheap all the time. And there are moments to be cheap. If you're comparing like paper to paper, like, I'm going to get the cheaper paper supply. Cool, smart. But I think if you just universally adopt that, it will be really hard to run your business because I think you'll miss opportunities to invest in a great person, to invest in a great location, because you just want to be the cheapest.
Right. So when you're looking for these A players, how are you assessing their skills? Because so many individuals go into an interview and they can look great on paper and they can kind of answer a lot of the generic questions well, but what are you seeing as far as like different differentiators in the market right now?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. One, I'm not going to pretend like I'm the sultan of truth and that you should listen to every word that I'd say. That would be my first disclaimer because I want to be cautious around like, I'll give advice where I think I can give it advice. And I still think I have advice on this subject, but like I'm a big believer in learning from people that are super far ahead of you. So I'd say first thing, that's my disclaimer. If I was going to look at hiring people, I think there's just universal concepts that make sense. One is kind of like dating. The more apples you see, the more you know of what a perfect apple looks like. There's kind of some metaphor for that. And, that's kind of the example with the apple tree. Don't know where it comes from. But I think if you take a look at a lot of candidates, I think you'll have a better idea of who's good or who's not. I think the way maybe you might do that wrong is if you want to look at a lot of people, but you extend it over a lot of, long period of time, you might, for example, I'll kind of slow it down here. If you were to hire, I would probably recommend having as many interviews in a short amount of time as possible, because I think the flip side is you spread out the interviews over months. And the downside is that you might have wanted someone who was interview number 5, but you don't realize that they're the best candidate until you're at interview number 30. And if too much time has passed, interviewee number 5, prospect number 5 might have been picked up and has another job. So I think first thing would be volume. Second thing would be compressed time so that you don't miss out on great candidates because you just dragged your feet. And then I think thirdly would have, be to have like a legitimate, consistent interview process. And what that looks like, I can't comment on necessarily in terms of like, this is the best way to do it. I do know that, again, Keith Cunningham's favorite book, or one of his favorite books, and a really good book on hiring, is called Who by Jeff Smart. And so I'd probably take a look at that book and read it. And then take a look at the insights from Jeff in that book to kind of develop your interview process, because I think he kind of breaks it up into multiple different interviews, multiple different objectives and different questions and background and reference checks and all that kind of stuff. So, I think those would be some things that would come to mind. The danger, I think that a lot of people, or the danger of hiring, I think in a lot of ways is you get impatient and then you just hire someone to hire someone. I think that's dangerous. I also think, it's dangerous to go too slow because I think you'll miss out on great candidates. And I think just winging it and having a conversation and making it based on who kind of makes you feel the best and maybe love yourself the most as an owner, I think is also a dangerous concept as well. in like a relationship setting, not to get like weird and off topic, but I heard something the other day that was something to the effect that people choose partners that make them or help them love themselves more. You know what I mean? Like you choose your partner because that person helps you love yourself more, because they like compliment you on the things that you like to be, or, you know, whatever, you get what you kind of want. And I think sometimes business owners are the same way, where they hire people that make them feel better as business owners versus what's best for the business. They do things that just make them feel good. And so I think if you have a loose interview process and you're, easily schmoozed, and complimented, like, similar to relationships, you'll see that kind of play out in a business, and I don't think it leads to great places.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think.
Flip it on its head. What are you thinking about, or what does your interview process look like?
Well, so right now,
do you need the book Who by Jeff Smart?
Yeah, I'm not really over highly incorporated into the hiring process right now. Right now, it's handled by my lab manager and my front end manager. But I will say that when I have done hiring in the past, I always ask them a question that I need solved for my business. And the reason why I ask those questions is, one, I can kind of articulate how well these people can come up with an idea out of nowhere. So I can kind of see how their mind works, because individuals who can say that they've done certain things, I can figure out really if they've done them before or not. Just based on the level of detail that they can go into the conversation. And the other part of that is, if they don't know how to solve the problem, why am I going to hire them? Right. So, one, I'm weeding out people who are going to BS the answer. Two, I'm weeding out the people who can't bring my business any benefits. Because if I hire them on, I'm still in the same spot I'm in now. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the way I look at it. Because even in this kind of goes back maybe a little bit towards kind of like what you've accomplished, is you can write down that you went to Clemson and you did all these great things, or you went to MSU or wherever you went. It doesn't mean that you can do a job well. Like, your experiences and what you've done will tell me whether or not you can do a job. I know, or I don't know anyone personally, but I know of people who do coding for computer systems, have never taken a college class legally. I guess they've just shown up and like learned the skill, right? But they learned the skill, they created something, and now they're working for a company because they created something on their own, and they don't have all these like fancy letters behind their name. They have the experiences versus just having this cookie cutter resume because they went to college. Granted, in the medical field, it's a little bit harder to do something like that, but it's more based off of experiences for me, and what they bring to the table.
Yeah. There was a good little snippet that I saw on, I forget whose podcast it was, but I saw it on TikTok. It's this kind of like English dude with glasses. That's the best way I could describe him. I'll have to find it for the next episode. But long story short, he interviews founders and stuff like that of a lot of well-known companies, and he was actually interviewing the founder or co-founder of Canva. It was started by a husband and wife, and I think maybe currently or at some point it was valued at, like, I want to say the number 40 billion comes to mind. That sounds really high when I say it out loud, but anyways, a multi-billion-dollar company. And they kind of talked about the process of when they were hiring a lot of people right off, kind of as they were growing and bringing on these executive positions, they kind of made a lot of mistakes around hiring because they were incorporating a lot of the status that these, kind of prospects, if you will, were bringing to the table. They would come with, I previously worked at Apple, I previously worked at Microsoft, I was a project manager, all that kind of stuff. And they were letting the labels and the titles of those people influence and create bias around who they should hire. And it was far less to do with like who they actually thought was just best. They were just, again, kind of leveraging those previous experience and the status. And it sounds like, again, in the clip that I saw, there wasn't a ton of due diligence into like how actually good they were at the companies, why they're no longer there, et cetera. It was more so along the, you held this title at this company, you're probably very good. And they kind of talked about in the clip, 6, 9, 12 months down the road, like how many employees, when they hired like that, they had to unwind and unravel and kind of get back on course because they weren't as smart as they thought they were, but they just relied on that title. And I think that obviously happens with degrees. And I think that happens with, people that come over from other employers. You kind of let those biases slip into place and you don't catch them. And then you hire someone and then, you probably don't want to admit that you're wrong for the first couple months because there's just pride involved and you think you can turn it around. You think you can iron out the details, but then you're 6, 9, 12 months down the road, nothing's changed. And because you were lackadaisical, or, loose in your hiring process and weren't as rigid in terms of your expectations of what you wanted and clear in what success looked like in the role, you pay for it on the back end.
Right. So I guess what would you say, how would you go about, let's say you do hire somebody, in how much time would you say is appropriate to say you're going to make the cut or you're not going to make the cut? Like, what would you say is appropriate, or what are your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the career. I'll give the example of if I hired a surgeon and they were bad, it's like life and death day one. You know what I mean? You got to reverse that decision quickly. Right. I think another way said is Amazon viewed it this way. I think this is a Bezos thing, but he said something like, we move fast when it's 2-way doors and we move slow when it's a 1-way door. So I think hiring is mostly kind of 2-way doors, but I think maybe there's some examples where it could be 1-way or whatever. But essentially the concept is if I can make a decision and reverse it really quickly, I'll move quicker. But if it's a decision where it's a fundamental, big change that, again, once I go through it, I can't go back, then I think that takes, kind of a lot more thought. And so where I guess I'm going with that is I think depending on how long they can stay or how long you can kind of figure it out is dependent on again, how life and death it is, how irreversible is this decision. I think if you brought on a project, maybe a product manager or something like that, and you were developing this new product, deploying all these resources behind it, I think if you knew it wasn't working out in the first couple of weeks, you get rid of it. I've heard of stories of people hiring people and firing people in the same day because of how they showed up to their first meeting, So I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think it depends on the importance of that role.
Makes sense. Yep.
You know what I mean? And then I think, so that's kind of the Bezos analogy there. But I think the other thing too is when you hire someone, again, depending on how they're paid, but if you're interpreting them as an A player and setting the expectation of that's what you're hiring, something that, again, I've read and heard, and I think Jeff talks about in his book, is there's typically never a time where you hire someone and you didn't think they were an A player and they become one. But there's
right.
Tons of examples where you thought they were an A player and then they aren't. So I think, if you think they're an A player and you're paying them like they're going to be an A player, and depending on maybe the cash position of the company, you can't afford for them to be a B player, you should reverse that decision pretty quickly. But again, I think expectations are a big part of this as well, because if you don't have clear expectations for what
right.
success looks like in the role, then the person might be thinking that they're doing a good job, but they just don't have clarity around what you ultimately want from them. So I think that's also the responsibility of the business owner, and something that Jeff talks about in his book, which is being super clear of the outcomes that you expect out of this position, and then the checkpoints and the timelines associated with those outcomes. Because again, that's just massively important to both you as the business owner and also the person that you just hired, and being fair to them in the sense of giving them a chance. You know what I mean? I think we can all think of examples or times in life where maybe we worked for a company and we didn't really know what they wanted. What are we optimizing for? And a great analogy that Keith says is A players love report card day, right? A students love report card day because they get to go home and say, look how good my grades are. They knew they were crushing it, and it's just the day where they get that final report card. C players don't. They hate report card day. So I think, one, having outcomes will kind of weed out people, because C players probably won't want to accept a job where there's clear outcomes and they just kind of pass or fail, you hit the mark or you didn't, because they just don't want to be held to things like that. And then also too, like A players that were A students to, rather like they love report card day, or they need targets on the wall because they need to know what they need to accomplish, right? Like if you were playing a game of soccer and there was 6 nets on the field and you didn't know which one actually constituted a goal, you could be very good at soccer but spend a bunch of time dribbling the ball in the wrong direction. And so I think companies do that as well, where they hire a phenomenal person, but because there's not clear outcomes, things that you wanted them to achieve, they can get lost. And then it's not necessarily the employee, it's the employer.
Right. No, I've definitely been there, and that can be really frustrating for an employee who doesn't know what to do. They know
they want to help, right?
Yeah.
But it's just what what am I supposed to do?
Right. Oh, absolutely. And I think here's the other really interesting thing that we've learned by always hiring is that we're also learning all the firing process, right? So
you crystal clear on that?
Right, because you have to know what do I have to have in order to fire somebody, right? Because in today's age, there are so many people who want to pull the trigger on you fired me, for no reason, or you fired me for the wrong reasons. And so making sure that we have things like performance improvement plans and all this documentation, because the he said, she said game is played out quite a bit. And so I would say that's another advantage of always hiring, is that you're also generally always firing, which can be a good thing. But you really are cleaning up your business side, and you're creating all these processes that make it a lot easier when you're doing either one of those processes.
Yeah, I think that's a benefit I didn't think about for sure, is on the firing side, because it's inevitable, right? It is inevitable that you're going to miss the mark. You won't find a CEO that's been around for more than 5 minutes that's that hasn't fired someone or hasn't completely whiffed on a hire. So knowing what to do and how to do it, I think also takes away the elephant in the room, or the monster in the closet of hiring someone. Because I think that's everyone's fear, is if I do have to fire this person, how do I do it? What do I need to do? You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah. So
and if you don't have that answer, you just won't hire.
Yeah. And it's definitely one of those conversations that's never easy to have. And once you've kind of had difficult conversations, if you've ever been in a fight with your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whatever, those aren't fun conversations to have, but they're conversations that you have to have about here's why X, Y, Z, here's why I'm not doing the dishes, and here's how I'm going to do a better job. They're not fun conversations, but you have to have them. And you just get good about having it, and it's less awkward. You don't feel like you missed the table. And a lot of times you leave that, even if it, let's say they were a good person, but they just were a crappy employee, you don't necessarily feel bad, and they don't feel bad because they know that they screwed up, right? You said, hey, I need you to be doing 80% of this script volume, well, in 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks, if you're not doing that, there's no one to blame but yourself. I have to fire you now, because if I don't, guess what everyone else is going to do? They're not going to do any of their work either. So I have to hold everyone to the same standard, and it becomes a very easy process from there. So definitely been beneficial for us.
Yeah. And I think too, with the firing process, it opens the door for you to be able to ask questions like, hey, is there anything we could have done better that wouldn't have resulted in us having to fire you? Or, sometimes I'm sure you'll get employees that will just say nope, you guys, I felt like you supported me. I just, XYZ reason didn't hit the mark. So I think that's obviously a huge learning experience. But I also think too, as an employer, and that maybe this depends on your worldview of how much you value your employees, but it's if you do want that person to be successful, you might need to fire them just to set them free from your company, from your position. It's just not the right fit for them, and they could go and flourish in something else, but it's just not here. And so I think if you do kind of care about your employees, that would be a mindset to adopt, which is I love you, I want to help you, but I can't help you here. Here's not the right place. Me firing you is letting you kind of go and find a better outcome for you that you'll be better at, get paid better for, all the above. And that maybe that's just like a personal belief system I have. But I think that's also probably a better way to also fire people too. I think Jeff talks about that in his book, but just like how to fire people, right? How to like have that conversation. So I think we could talk about hiring and firing for a long time. So we don't want to make the first air quotes episode of the Money Medicine podcast super, super long. But let's just say this. Next episode will be the official, have the intro. We'll kind of go down the rabbit hole, starting to broaden the scope a little bit of the episode. We'll definitely still have a ton of pharmacy specific stuff. Logan still works at a pharmacy. I still work with a lot of pharmacy clients, so it doesn't change anything there. I just think, again, it opens the door where we can bring on guests that feel like if it's not just pharmacy specific, they have a reason to come on. And if they have a reason to come on and we can tailor it to pharmacies, we can tailor it to, functional medicine practices, et cetera, then it's a win-win for everyone. So that's the direction that we're going. And, sorry for the delay, maybe moving into 2023 with getting some episodes out, but we kind of rearranged some things, thought about this rebrand, and we're back and ready to pump out consistent content.